Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a genuinely mind-blowing piece of physical historiography. We're looking at a massive hypothesis that literally links the mythical origins of ancient Chinese civilization directly to the foundational roots of the Japanese imperial line. We're talking about tracing the legacy of Tenko, the heavenly sovereign, the legendary first ruler of ancient China, and the idea that his lineage didn't just fade into mythology, but actually packed up and relocated to the Japanese archipelago. It's this wild, brilliant intersection of myth, archaeology, and genetics. So let's just get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We've got 6 parts to cover today. 1. The myth becomes history. 2. The Tenko-Tenno culture connection. 3. Sovereign versus emperor logic. 4. The strategic maritime exodus. 5. The Jomon and Tenko synthesis. And 6. The unbroken imperial line.
Starting things off with Section 1, the myth becomes history.
So at the very core of this whole hypothesis is the heavenly sovereign himself. Now, if you know ancient Chinese legends, you know the dawn of civilization is ruled by the 3 sovereigns, right? And the absolute head of that trio is Tenko, or Surayenshi. Traditionally, he's the guy famous for the ultimate technological upgrade, the invention of fire. But our source takes a really analytical approach here. They argue this isn't just quaint folklore, this was a biological historical paradigm shift. By mastering fire, humanity suddenly went from raw meat to cooked food, and the knock-on effects were huge. Drastically fewer infectious diseases, massive spikes in calorie absorption, and it actually fueled the expansion of human brain capacity. It's literally the technological spark that allowed us to stop wandering and settle down for good.
Because of this massive contribution, Tenko was revered as the Sui Huang of China, the common ancestor of Hoxia. And the really key takeaway from the hypothesis here is that Tenko wasn't some dictator ruling through fear or military might. He was a cultural hero. He held absolute authority simply because he provided a revolutionary technology, fire, that fundamentally changed the game for human survival. It was all about providing blessings, not subjugation.
All right, moving on to Section 2, the Tenko-Tenno culture connection.
So you might be wondering, if Tenko was a real flesh-and-blood historical figure who kick-started agricultural settlement, where's the actual physical evidence? Well, the hypothesis points us straight to the Neolithic Tenko-Tenno culture in the middle reaches of the Yangtze River, specifically northwestern Hunan province. This dates back to roughly 7500 BC to 6100 BC, making it currently the earliest known trace of permanent settlement in China, and it perfectly aligns with the Tenko myth. Archaeologists have dug up tons of cultivated rice here, along with cord-marked pottery, so the timeline, the geography, and the technology are a perfect match. This was, hypothetically, the real-world land of Tenko.
And when you look deeper into the late phase of this culture, you hit the Bashidang site, which is just incredible. Excavators there unearthed a staggering 15,000 grains of ancient rice and even soybeans, which proves they had this highly advanced agro-ecosystem going on. But honestly, the most fascinating part is this uniquely geometric, star-shaped platform sitting right at the center of the settlement. The source proposes this was actually a foundational institutional framework for astronomical observation. You know, in a farming society, tracking the stars to build a reliable planting calendar is absolutely crucial. This platform effectively linked the sovereign's agricultural timeline directly to the cosmos and the providence of nature.
Which brings us to Section 3, Sovereign versus Emperor logic.
Okay, so if this society was so advanced and incredibly peaceful, what happened? Well, this brilliantly illustrates the core philosophical divide in ancient East Asia. On one hand, you have the logic of the sovereign. This was maintained by groups known as the Dongji and Sanmiao, who are the descendants of Tenko. It's entirely based on peaceful endorsement, technological benefits, agricultural abundance, and natural harmony. But then on the flip side, you have the logic of the emperor, which cropped up later in the Central Plains. And this system is the exact opposite. It is predicated absolutely on military conquest, subjugation of other tribes, and violent dynastic revolution. So it's literally life and agricultural blessing versus submission through brutal force.
Let's look at the timeline to see how this played out. We kick off with that peaceful Tenko-Tenno culture around 7500 BC. Fast forward to 3800 BC, the ancient state period, and leadership is still transferring peacefully between clans. But then, around 2510 BC, that violent emperor logic rises up in the Central Plains, bringing just endless wars of unification. The descendants of the sovereign, the Sanmiao and Dongyi, faced intense subjugation and persecution. And that marginalized reality sets the stage for a massive historical crisis, leading right up to 219 BC.
So, with this violent emperor logic completely dominating the continent through sheer military might, the original, peaceful, sovereign civilization was staring total eradication in the face. Which leaves us with a really crucial question. How on earth did this ancient civilization, this original source code of harmony and agriculture, manage to escape complete annihilation? Let's find out in Section 4, the Strategic Maritime Exodus. To answer that question, we have to look across the sea. Now, you've probably heard the classic legend of Shu Fu, the guy sent by Qin Shi Huang in 219 BC to hunt down an elixir of immortality, right? Well, our source frames this through a completely different lens. They argue this famous expedition was actually a massive strategic exodus. Right before the sovereign civilizational paradigm could be wiped off the map by the emperor system, an elite group holding the legitimate bloodlines and advanced tech executed a grand evacuation. Their destination? The Japanese archipelago, essentially a perfectly isolated safe haven.
And this exiled elite, who show up in Japanese myth as the Tenson tribe, they definitely didn't show up empty-handed. They brought an entire civilizational package over to northern Kyushu. We're talking advanced wet rice farming, sophisticated bronze and iron metallurgy, that ancient astronomical and ritual cosmology they inherited all the way from Tenko, and even advanced military tech like the crossbow. They literally carried the software and hardware of a complete civilization across the water, ready for a full reboot.
Let's move to Section 5 and see how this built, the Jomon and Tenko synthesis.
This is where we hit the real climax of the hypothesis, the integration of two totally distinct populations to establish the Japanese imperial line. So, on the archipelago you have the native Jomon people. The source highlights that the Jomon male lineage, which heavily carried the D haplogroup, was extraordinarily peaceful. Archaeology shows a pretty striking lack of weapons for warfare among them, and they didn't even have a tradition of surnames. The hypothesis asserts that these peaceful Jomon males integrated with the incoming Tenko elite, specifically through the female lineage who are the ones bringing in that advanced agriculture and metallurgy. By intentionally absorbing this Tenko bloodline through maternal mitochondrial DNA, the ancient kingship preserved the sovereign's foundational framework of peaceful governance.
And this physical relocation isn't just speculation. It's anchored in primary source documentation. Take the Book of Han, a classical Chinese history. It explicitly states, the Eastern Yi crossed the Great Sea to offer national treasures. Remember, the Eastern Yi, or Dong Yi, are the direct lineage of Tenkosu. So this historical excerpt really supports the idea that the ancient sovereigns didn't just vanish into thin air. Their leaders actually physically relocated to the archipelago, bringing the treasures of their civilization right along with them.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, the unbroken imperial line.
So, how is this cultural synthesis protected for the long haul? You might be familiar with the term Bansei Ikkei, which translates to the unbroken line of emperors. But academically speaking, the source defines this as way more than just a biological lineage. It was a robust protocol, a deliberate system design created to permanently nullify that violent emperor logic that had destroyed their ancestors back on the continent. By completely separating sacred authority, which was held exclusively by the emperor, from practical, everyday military power, which was handed to shoguns or regents, they essentially made the violent usurpation of the throne systematically impossible. It's a brilliant institutional safeguard.
And the ultimate proof of this geopolitical stance happens in the late 7th century. At that time, the absolute hegemonic power in East Asia was the Tang dynasty, and their ruler used the title Kotei, meaning emperor. But the Japanese kingship made a really stinging ideological declaration. They flat out rejected the title Kotei. Instead, they revived the ancient characters for Tenno, heavenly sovereign. By doing this, they were explicitly rejecting the Sinocentric logic of military usurpation and declaring themselves the legitimate, unbroken heirs to the original peaceful founder of civilization, Tenko.
It is just a breathtaking historical narrative, isn't it? Tracing a line all the way from a 9,000-year-old campfire in the Yangtze River Basin directly to the throne of Japan. It's a story of an ancient operating system for civilization. One built on technological blessing and cosmic harmony, essentially cryogenically preserved in an island nation. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. As humanity approaches new and totally unpredictable historical shifts, could this ancient paradigm of peaceful governance, preserved for millennia, actually hold the key to redesigning our future society? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this sparks your curiosity to dig even deeper into the hidden layers of our shared history. Catch you next time.
Usually when we talk about ancient mythology, there's this expectation of a certain, well, a poetic vagueness to it.
Right, yeah, like it should be a bit blurry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is sort of like looking at a watercolor painting. You see the broad strokes, a cultural hero over here, a god of fire over there.
And the historian just points at it and says, there is a beautiful metaphor for human struggle.
Right. It is comfortable. We like our ancient myths to stay safely in the realm of stories, categorized as fables that are just meant to teach us moral lessons.
Absolutely.
But when you step into the world of physical historiography and advanced Neolithic archaeology, that watercolor painting suddenly turns into a high-resolution satellite photograph.
Yeah, it becomes incredibly tangible.
Right. And for you listening today, we want to challenge how you view these ancient stories. Because the legendary 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors of ancient East Asia, they weren't just mythical figures drifting around in the clouds of antiquity.
No, not at all.
We are looking at historical realities here, like exact geographical coordinates, precise chronologies, and fossil archaeological evidence that you can actually hold in your hand.
Yeah, we are moving entirely out of the realm of deciphering metaphors today. We are getting into the realm of analyzing carbon-dated sediment, microscopic plant fossils, and deep genetic markers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it is a complete paradigm shift in how we understand the dawn of civilization, because we are basically tracking a highly specific framework of peaceful governance.
Okay.
And this framework, well, it was born in the continental wetlands. It was violently displaced by a completely different system of power. And then it was ultimately preserved through an incredibly deliberate biological and cultural integration.
And to trace this properly, we are relying strictly on the archaeological and historiographical data.
Right.
We are looking at foundational paradigms and biological preservation protocols.
Exactly. There are no modern analogies here. We are doing a strict historiographical and archaeological analysis. We are just looking at the raw mechanics of how human societies survive.
Right, no comparisons to modern tech or anything like that, just the raw history.
Yes.
But before we really dive in, there is one crucial phonetic distinction we need to establish right out of the gate for the listener, because it forms the entire backbone of this narrative.
Right, this is so important.
When we're talking about the ancient continental founder, the head of the 3 sovereigns, we will pronounce his title explicitly as Tenko.
Yes, Tenko.
But when we refer to the later monarch on the Japanese archipelago, who adopted those exact same characters centuries later, we will pronounce it as Tenno.
Exactly. That phonetic distinction is the absolute key to decoding a massive geopolitical manifesto, which we will uncover as we go.
Right.
But to understand why the later archipelago kingship would claim the mantle of Tenko, well, we have to start at the physical origin point of that title.
The very beginning.
Exactly. So the foundational legend of Tenko, who is also known in the ancient texts as Suenshi, centers entirely around the discovery of fire. According to the tradition, Surenshi observed a woodpecker pecking at a tree and generating sparks. And by studying this, he realized humanity could actively rub branches together, using friction to create and control fire at will.
See, in a standard mythological reading, that is just a quaint Promethean origin story, like somebody brings fire and yay, now we have light.
Right. A nice little fable.
But looking at the physical historiography, mastering fire triggers a massive biological phase transition. Controlling fire isn't just about staying warm or fending off predators. It completely rewrites the human diet.
It absolutely does. It ends the era of consuming raw meat and brings humanity into the era of cooked food. And, the biological ramifications of that shift just cannot be overstated. From an epidemiological standpoint, cooking meat dramatically reduces the incidence of infectious diseases.
I mean, I would imagine so, the parasites alone.
Exactly. Parasites and pathogens that are completely rampant in raw connective tissue are suddenly neutralized. But beyond sheer survival, the metabolic shift is profound.
How so?
Well, cooking breaks down complex proteins and carbohydrates before they even enter your stomach.
So your body doesn't have to burn a massive amount of its own energy just to digest a raw meal.
Right. Your digestion and absorption efficiency skyrocket. Evolutionary biologists calculate that this sudden caloric surplus directly contributed to the expansion of human brain capacity.
Wow, really? just from cooking.
Yes, and a significant extension of lifespan. The energy previously wasted on digestion was reallocated to neurological development.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, and this biological stabilization was the absolute prerequisite for humanity to transition away from the harsh, nomadic hunter-gatherer existence. It laid the groundwork for a permanent settlement.
You know, when I was looking through the mythological texts surrounding Tenko, what really stood out to me was his governance style. Like, he is revered as the common ancestor, the absolute founder of civilization, but he wasn't a warlord.
No, not at all.
He didn't conquer his neighbors with a standing army. His authority seemed to stem entirely from the fact that he fundamentally upgraded human existence.
Exactly. He is the archetype of the cultural hero. Under this ancient paradigm, absolute authority wasn't derived from the point of a spear.
Right.
It was derived from providing an overwhelming technological and biological benefit to humanity. The people followed him because he literally offered them a safer, longer life.
So for a long time, the traditional narratives tried to place the birthplace of this fire myth in the Central Plains, right, around Henan province.
He did, yes.
But the actual physical evidence, the earliest systematic use of fire, the oldest traces of permanent settlement, it drags the map completely south.
It shifts the entire focus.
Yeah, the coordinates align perfectly with the middle reaches of the Yangtze River. We're looking at the Pentushan culture in modern-day northwestern Hunan province, dating way back to roughly 7500 BC to 6100 BC.
Right, and the transition from the late Pleistocene to the early Holocene epochs is really what sets the stage for this.
Explain that a bit for the listener.
Well, as the Ice Age ended and global temperatures warmed up, precipitation patterns changed drastically. Vast wetlands and massive lake systems formed in the Yangtze River basin.
Oh, okay.
So this rich, temperate freshwater ecosystem was just the perfect biological incubator for humans to stop moving and start settling.
So the Ice Age ends, the glaciers melt, and Hunan province turns into this massive, resource-rich swamp.
Basically.
And the Pentushan site, which was excavated in the late 1980s, proves they took advantage of this. I mean, it covers about 2 hectares, and it is currently recognized as the earliest trace of a permanent village ever discovered in China.
It is incredibly significant.
But the real smoking gun for the Tenko hypothesis isn't just the fact that they stayed in one place, it is what they baked into their pottery.
Yes, the pottery at Pentushan is a phenomenal historical archive. The clay used to bake their vessels is abundantly mixed with rice husks and carbonized rice grains.
Okay, I have to pause here because I really want you, the listener, to think about this. If I am wandering around a prehistoric wetland that is naturally full of wild rice, right?
Great.
And I drop a slab of wet clay in the mud, it is obviously going to get rice husks stuck in it.
Sure, just by accident.
So how do archaeologists prove that the rice embedded in this 9,000-year-old pottery was intentionally farmed? And not just wild swamp grass they happen to gather. Is this like finding a carefully bred heirloom tomato in a prehistoric camp, proving someone actively cultivated it?
That is a very apt way to look at it because, an heirloom tomato doesn't occur naturally.
Right.
It is the result of intentional selective breeding by humans over multiple generations. And archaeologists apply that exact same logic to prehistoric agriculture through morphological analysis.
Morphological analysis, so looking at the shape.
Exactly. They measure the physical shape and size of the rice grains trapped in the Pentushan pottery. And these grains are distinctly, uniformly larger and wider than any wild rice variant found in nature.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you only achieve that uniform enlarged grain when humans are actively selecting the largest, most robust seeds from one harvest to plant for the next year.
That makes perfect sense.
And they date this using the carbonized organic matter trapped right inside the fired clay.
So the dates are rock solid.
Very solid. Radiocarbon dating of those specific cultivated rice residues places them between 8200 BC and 7800 BC.
That is incredibly early.
It is. By the time the Pentushan culture is fully established, the domestication of rice wasn't some new experiment. It was already fully realized and incorporated as their foundational food source.
So the mythological narrative of Tenko, the cultural hero who ended the era of raw meat and initiated settled agricultural society, it maps flawlessly onto the physical reality of Hunan province and the Pentushan site.
It is a perfect match.
We have the empirical proof of fire used to bake pottery, we have permanent settlements, and we have cultivated rice.
Yes.
But establishing that Hunan is the physical land of Tenko opens up a massive logistical question. Well, once you have thousands of people staying in one place, and they are relying on agriculture, You need a highly organized society.
Absolutely. You cannot have agriculture on that scale without intense organization. To understand the maturation of that society, we look at the terminal phase of the Pengtushan culture.
Okay.
Specifically, we look at a site called Bashidang, which is also located in Hunan province. Bashidang really reveals the highly structured social system and the specific cosmology possessed by the direct descendants of Tenko.
The scale of Bashidang is what caught my attention. I mean, we aren't talking about a loose cluster of huts here.
No, not at all.
This is a roughly 3-hectare settlement, and it is completely surrounded by an earthen rampart and a massive moat or ditch. Like, it is the earliest known moated settlement excavated in China.
It is a massive undertaking.
And inside, archaeologists found dense clusters of post holes, which points to rows of stilt houses built to handle the humid, flood-prone environment.
Yes, stilt architecture, or pile dwellings, are an incredibly sophisticated adaptation to wetland environments. But the most significant feature is indeed that defensive perimeter.
See, that moat is a bit of a paradox to me, though.
How so?
Well, if the logic of the sovereign under Tenko was entirely peaceful, right? If it relied on the benevolent gifting of technology like agriculture, why build massive walls and moats?
That is a fair question.
I mean, excavating a 3-hectare moat requires an astronomical amount of organized labor. Were they just managing floods, or does this prove they were already fighting off neighbors, even in this early utopian framework?
Well, in the Yangtze Basin, advanced flood control is a non-negotiable requirement for survival, so water management was certainly a primary function.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, building an earthen rampart of that scale undoubtedly serves to demarcate social boundaries and protect accumulated agricultural wealth.
Because they had a surplus.
Exactly. If you have the only massive surplus of cultivated rice in the region, neighboring nomadic or less successful agrarian groups will eventually have to take it.
Right. But the key here is how they organized the labor to build it.
Right, because without a military to, force people to dig ditches, how do you get thousands of people to move tons of earth?
You utilize a completely different mechanism of authority. The logic of the sovereign, the Huang system, is predicated on harmonizing with natural providence.
Okay, harmonize with nature.
Right. Organizing this labor necessitates an absolute authority, a sovereign, who directs the population through religious or cosmological devotion rather than coercive violence.
That is a huge distinction.
It is.
Yeah.
And the physical evidence for this cosmological authority was found right in the center of the Bashidang settlement.
The star-shaped platform.
Exactly.
I read the excavation reports on this, and it is just fascinating. Right in the middle of the village, there is an elevated platform of earth, raised about 30 to 50 centimeters.
Yes.
And it is distinctly geometric, like literally shaped like a star, which means it obviously wasn't a house. It was explicitly designed for ritual.
Yeah. And surrounding this platform, they found over 80 deep, vertically walled pits.
And those pits were not refuse dumps. They were intentionally constructed ritual pits. Inside, archaeologists found carefully placed offerings.
Like what kind of offerings?
Things like burnt earth, specific pottery vessels, selected animal bones, and quite remarkably, decorative rods made of polished black stone.
Wow. Polished stone.
Right, and polished stone tools required immense labor to create and were incredibly rare at this point in the Neolithic period. Depositing them into the earth demonstrates a profound devotion to the rituals taking place on that platform.
But how does a star-shaped platform help an agricultural society actually function? Like, what are they doing up there?
Well, to grow rice on a massive scale, guesswork leads to starvation.
Right. You can't just plant seeds whenever you feel like it.
Exactly. You need precise, reliable, astronomical knowledge. You have to observe the subtle movements of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the shifting constellations.
To make a calendar.
Yes. To construct an accurate calendar for sowing seeds and anticipating seasonal floods. Under the sovereign paradigm initiated by Tenko, the paramount duty of the leader was to act as the supreme intermediary between the cosmos and the earth.
So the platform is essentially an ancient astronomical observatory.
It was an antenna for communicating with natural providence. The sovereign observes the celestial mechanics, deciphers the seasonal cycles, and bestows that knowledge upon the people as the agricultural calendar.
That is incredible.
And because of that, the crops succeed, the people thrive, and in return, they grant the sovereign absolute peaceful authority. It is a system of mutual, life-sustaining endorsement.
And the agricultural yield they achieved with this system was just staggering. I mean, the Bashidang excavations pulled up over 15,000 cultivated rice grains.
It is an immense amount of data.
They found bone spades, specifically designed for farming. They found water caltrop, lotus, early peach pits, and the absolute earliest evidence of soybean cultivation in southern China. They didn't just grow rice. They engineered a comprehensive, highly diversified agroecosystem.
And this is the critical engine of early civilization. When a society creates a massive caloric surplus, it frees up a segment of the population from the daily grind of finding food.
Because not everyone has to be a farmer anymore.
Exactly. This allows for social stratification. You can support a dedicated class of astronomers, priests, and artisans.
Right.
You can organize the labor to dig a 3-hectare moat and build a star-shaped platform. And in the sovereign paradigm, all of this complex societal advancement is achieved without a standing army forcing compliance.
But history shows us over and over again that accumulated wealth, especially a massive agricultural surplus, it always attracts a violent element.
Inevitably, yes.
The peaceful agrarian paradigm of Tenko is eventually going to collide with a very different, highly aggressive system. And to understand that collision, we have to look at exactly who these founders were.
Yes, we do.
Because they were not the people we typically read about in the standard histories.
No, they were not. Traditional, later continental historiography heavily promotes the narrative that civilization was uniquely founded by the Huaxia tribe.
The ancestors of the modern Han Chinese.
Right, centered in the Central Plains along the Yellow River. However, rigorous analysis of the earliest texts and physical evidence proves the founders of the sovereign paradigm did not belong to the Huaxia.
They belonged to the Dongyi and the Jiuli groups.
Yes. The ancestral homeland of the Dongyi originally spanned the eastern coastal areas, roughly from modern-day Shandong province down through Jiangsu.
Okay.
Culturally, they were deeply associated with bird totems. Ancient texts record that Fuxi, the earthly sovereign who directly succeeded Tenko, possessed the surname Feng.
Feng.
Yes. The Feng surname is universally recognized as the oldest surname on the continent, and it is a specific, exclusive attribute of these coastal Dongyi groups.
You know, even Mencius, one of the most respected ancient philosophers, he flat out wrote that later foundational figures like Shun and Yu were people of Dongyi.
He did.
So the true architects of this entire civilizational framework, the people who mastered fire, who pioneered wet rice farming, developed the calendar, and even laid the groundwork for early written characters, were the Dongyi.
Exactly.
But the later Huaxia victors basically rewrote the history books and rebranded them as barbarians, or Yi.
It is the classic mechanism of Victor's historiography. The Huaxia tribe eventually seized absolute hegemony over the Central Plains.
Right, the winners write the history.
Exactly. To legitimize their rule, they centered themselves as the originators of civilization, actively marginalizing the Dongyi in the official records. To uncover the physical reality of Tenko, we have to bypass thousands of years of this textual manipulation and look at the physical movement of these peoples.
Which brings us to the Battle of Zuolu, right around 2500 BC. This is the absolute singularity point where the two paradigms just smash into each other.
Yes, the Battle of Zuolu is where the peaceful logic of the sovereign meets the violent logic of the emperor, or the D system.
Okay, the emperor system.
Right. The Huaxia tribe, led by Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, were the champions of this new emperor paradigm.
And the emperor system is fundamentally different from what Tenko built.
It is the polar opposite. The emperor paradigm is predicated entirely on military conquest, the subjugation of neighboring groups by brute force, and rule through absolute hegemony. It relies on a martial hierarchy.
It introduces the concept of violent dynastic revolution.
Yes, it does.
It is this brutal logic that if you have a strong enough army, you are completely justified in slaughtering the current ruler and taking the throne. It is just a cycle of bloodshed that would define continental history for millennia.
Absolutely. In the Battle of Zuolu, Huangdi deployed this militaristic paradigm to devastating effect, defeating Qiu, the paramount leader of the Dongyi and Jiuli coalition.
Oh, man.
This was a catastrophic, paradigm-shattering defeat for the peaceful agrarian society. Their leadership was decimated, and the displaced descendants of the Jiuli were forced into a massive retreat.
Right, because they couldn't stay in the north.
No, they had to flee south, back into the vast, watery wetlands of the middle Yangtze River basin. They retreated to the ancestral heartland of Tenko and the Pengtushan culture.
And once they regroup in Hunan and the surrounding lakes, They take on a new historical identity, right? The Sanmiao.
Yes, the Sanmiao. They settled around the sprawling Dongting and Priam lake systems across Hunan, Hubei, and Jiangxi provinces. And they survived by leveraging their ancestral mastery of wetland rice farming.
Now, traditional continental text usually translate Sanmiao as a derogatory label, right? Like something applied by the victorious Huaxia.
That is how it is often read, yes.
But when analyzed through their own cultural continuity, the name is actually a proud, defiant manifesto. Sanmiao literally translates to the seedlings of the three.
Exactly, the seedlings of the three sovereigns. They were explicitly declaring, we are the true uncorrupted lineage of Tenko, the earthly sovereign and the human sovereign.
It was an absolute assertion of legitimacy.
It really was. They were proclaiming themselves the original architects of civilization. And because they held this unshakable conviction, they absolutely refused to submit to the new emperor system dominating the Central Plains.
They fought a fierce, centuries-long resistance against subsequent Huaxia rulers, right? Like Yao, Shun, and Yu.
They did. They fought very hard.
Because they knew that if they submitted to a system built on violent usurpation, it would inevitably corrupt and destroy the harmonious, nature-bound framework they inherited from Tenko.
Right. And because the Sanmiao fiercely resisted assimilation, the victorious northern regimes subjected them to relentless military campaigns. And they permanently branded them in the official histories as one of the four perils, essentially equating them to chaotic monsters.
Now, I want to be incredibly clear about how we are looking at this for you, the listener.
Yeah.
We are analyzing the mechanics of historiography objectively here.
Absolutely.
We are not taking a moral stance or picking a good guy between the Huaxia and the Sanmiao. We're just observing the cold reality of how history is written. The Huaxia won the war, so they controlled the ink.
Exactly.
They wrote the text that labeled the Sanmiao as perils, which deliberately obscured the fact that the Sanmiao were actually the originators of the agricultural calendar and the peaceful governance system.
That objectivity is paramount. We are tracking the displacement of a paradigm, not assigning moral judgments to ancient warfare.
Right.
What is scientifically undeniable, however, is the Sanmiao's role as a biological and cultural archive, and we can track this physically using phytoliths.
Phytoliths. These are fascinating. Please explain how a plant leaves a fossil that lasts thousands of years.
It is really quite amazing. A phytolith is a microscopic structure made of silica. As a plant, like a rice stalk, draws up groundwater, it also absorbs soluble silica.
Okay, silica from the water.
Right. And this silica gets deposited within the plant cells, creating a tiny, rigid, glass-like cast of the cell structure.
A glass cast of a cell. That is wild.
Yeah. And when the plant dies and decays, these microscopic silica casts, the phytoliths, remain perfectly preserved in the soil for millennia.
Because they're basically glass. They don't rot.
Exactly. By extracting and analyzing the specific shapes of these phytoliths, along with ancient DNA sequencing, geneticists can map the exact evolutionary origin and geographic spread of cultivated rice.
And that map leads directly back to the Sanmiao.
It points unequivocally to the Middle Yangtze Basin. Despite being militarily outmatched in the north, the Sanmiao fell back to their wetlands and functioned as a massive repository.
Wow.
They protected the foundational knowledge of advanced wet rice farming and the rituals of the sovereign paradigm, insulating it as best they could from the violent northern incursions.
But this brings up a brutal question about human society. I mean, the Sanmiao had superior agricultural output, they possessed deeply advanced astronomical knowledge, and they had the immense social organization required to build massive civic works, like the moats at Bashidang.
They had all of that, yes.
So if they had all of those advantages, why were they consistently crushed by the Huaxia emperor paradigm? Does the sovereign logic possess a fatal structural flaw? Is a peaceful, astronomically guided society simply incapable of surviving a militarized neighbor?
That is the tragic, inherent vulnerability of the sovereign paradigm. A society whose entire organizing principle is harmonizing with nature, advancing agriculture, and ruling through peaceful endorsement inherently lacks the systemic infrastructure for total war.
Right, because building a defensive moat is a static defense.
Exactly. It is not the same as mass mobilizing an aggressive military force. The emperor system prioritizes martial prowess, the rapid weaponization of metallurgy, and territorial expansion.
So in a direct clash,
In a direct physical clash on a shared continent, the logic of rapid violence will almost inevitably overwhelm the logic of peaceful agrarianism.
the Sanmiao were basically fighting a war of attrition they were structurally designed to lose.
Unfortunately, yes.
And as the centuries grind on, The relentless military expansion from the Central Plains reaches a horrific crescendo. By the time we enter the Warring States period, and eventually the Qin dynasty around 221 BC, the violence is unprecedented.
The Unification Wars, commanded by Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin, were wars of absolute annihilation.
Absolute annihilation.
Yes, they were designed to obliterate rival states, erase their cultures, and unify the continent under one supreme, violent autocracy.
Wow.
For the remaining Dongyi bloodlines still clinging to their coastal strongholds in places like Shandong province, this represented total imminent extinction.
I mean, if you are the last surviving elite of the ancient sovereign lineage, you are watching the continent burn.
Literally burn.
You know your civilization is about to be completely erased. To avoid eradication, you have to execute an unprecedented survival strategy.
Yeah.
Because you can't fight the Qin army.
No, you cannot.
You have to leave the continent entirely.
Exactly. They realized the continent was permanently consumed by the emperor system. Their only viable strategy was a grand maritime exodus, escaping across the eastern seas to reconstruct their sovereign paradigm in a geographically isolated sanctuary.
Which brings us to the legendary fleet of Xu Fu. Now, the standard story, the one most people know, is that Xu Fu was a court sorcerer.
Right, the traditional tale.
Qin Shi Huang, terrified of dying, ordered Xu Fu to sail east to find elixir of immortality. And Xu Fu took a fleet, vanished into the ocean, and never came back.
That is the story, yes.
But when we view this through the lens of physical historiography, that elixir narrative falls apart completely.
It does. The traditional narrative is a cover story. Xu Fu hailed from the state of Qi, located in modern Shandong province, and this was an ancient Dongyi stronghold.
Okay, so he was one of them.
Yes, his very surname, Shu, derives from a much older Dongyi state. He wasn't a loyal sorcerer running an errand for a tyrant. He was a leader of the displaced elite. This was a highly calculated, massive evacuation project. He wasn't searching for a magic potion. He was executing a physical preservation strategy for a dying civilization.
If you look at the historical records of the logistics, it is so obvious. Xu Fu didn't just take a crew of sailors. The records state he took thousands of young men and women.
Thousands.
He took the 100 artisans, master craftsmen, metallurgists, shipbuilders, and he explicitly took the seeds of the 5 sacred grains.
Exactly.
You do not pack heavy bags of agricultural seed and thousands of diverse tradespeople if your only goal is to find a single cup of magic water for a king.
You certainly do not. That cargo manifest is the exact inventory required to transplant a comprehensive civilizational framework to an uninhabited or deeply underdeveloped landmass.
It is the ancient equivalent of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault.
That is a great comparison.
Except they weren't just packing seeds into a frozen mountain bunker. They packed the seeds, the agricultural engineering, the bronze metallurgy, the astronomical cosmology, the entire sociocultural framework onto a massive fleet of ships.
Yes, they buried their seed vault in the geographic isolation of an ocean archipelago. The leaders of this immense evacuation, the custodians of the 3 sovereigns' legacy, are identified within this hypothesis as the Tenson tribe, or the heavenly grandchildren.
Heavenly grandchildren.
Right, and this group includes central foundational figures that appear in Japanese mythology, most notably Nigi Hayahi.
So this massive fleet survives the ocean crossing and arrives on the Japanese archipelago. What happens to the physical landscape of Japan when this concentrated package of civilization lands?
The archaeological impact is immediate and foundational. The Tenson tribe introduces the cosmology of Tenko, the highly advanced wet rice farming techniques perfected by the Sanmiao in the Yangtze Basin, and sophisticated bronze and iron manufacturing.
That is a lot of new technology at once.
It is a massive shift. This sudden influx of population and technology established the absolute foundation for a new, centralized kingship on the archipelago, which would eventually evolve into the state of Yamato.
We can actually trace their arrival physically by looking at the concentration of wealth, specifically in northern Kyushu, right?
Precisely. If we look at the power base of Himiko, the first priestess queen of Yamatai, it was situated in northern Kyushu, stretching roughly from the coast of Hakata Bay down to the Chikuho region.
Right.
Scientifically, when archaeologists map the distribution of prestige goods from this specific era, meaning advanced iron tools, iron weapons, and intricate bronze mirrors, there is a massive, unprecedented concentration strictly within this northern Kyushu corridor.
Wow.
This physical data proves a sudden, massive influx and rapid accumulation of advanced continental technology arriving directly from across the sea.
So the civilization survives the crossing. They successfully transplant the sovereign paradigm onto an isolated island.
Yes.
But they're not naive. They know the violent emperor logic still dominates the mainland, and empires eventually expand. They need to build a sophisticated geopolitical defense mechanism to ensure the continent can never justify invading them. And more importantly, to ensure that the violent cycle of dynastic revolution can never take root internally.
Right. That geopolitical shield required a masterpiece of diplomatic strategy, which really reached its culmination in the late 7th century. By this period, the absolute hegemonic superpower dominating East Asia was Tang China.
Okay, the Tang dynasty.
And the monarch of the Tang dynasty operated under the title Kotei, which is the definitive translation of emperor.
Right, so in the Sinocentric world order, the tributary system is everything. The exact title a foreign ruler uses defines their explicit place within the Tang hierarchy.
Correct. The kingship on the Japanese archipelago was actively finalizing its own framework as a unified, centralized state. If they had chosen to style their ruler as Kotei, or if they had accepted the title of Wang, meaning king, bestowed by the Tang court,
It would have been a concession.
it would have been a catastrophic diplomatic and ideological concession. It would have meant officially, legally submitting to the Tang hierarchy, and by extension, validating the logic of the emperor, the exact logic of military supremacy and violent usurpation that had slaughtered their Dongji ancestors.
So they needed a title that established their absolute sovereignty, avoiding a direct military proclamation, while simultaneously asserting their total ideological independence.
Exactly. And to thread that diplomatic needle, the archipelago kingship executed an act of profound ideological brilliance. They dug into the deepest origins of their ancestral history and revived the specific ancient characters for Tenko.
The original Tenko.
Yes, the very first of the three sovereigns, the original peaceful founder of civilization from the Hunan wetlands. They applied those exact characters to their own ruler, creating the title Tenno.
The phonetic execution of this is just fascinating. They deliberately chose the characters for Tenko to send a message to China. But domestically, they read those characters as Okimi or Sumaramakoto, and eventually formalized the pronunciation as Tenno. This was a dual-layered diplomatic code.
It operated flawlessly on two fronts. Domestically, pronouncing it as Okimi or Sumaramakoto maintained a seamless continuity with their indigenous traditions of sacred spiritual kingship.
That makes sense.
But internationally, when the Tang diplomats and scribes unrolled the official state documents, they visually read the characters for Tenko. It was a stinging, undeniable manifesto.
They were essentially telling the Tang superpower, we reject your Kotei title because your entire system is stained with the blood of violent dynastic revolution. We claim direct, legitimate descent from the original peaceful founders of civilization. Our authority predates your violent empire.
It was the ultimate assertion of legitimacy. They were declaring themselves the sole possessors of the pure, uncorrupted lineage of civilization.
That is so bold.
It was. But claiming a title does not prevent a rogue general from staging a military coup.
Right.
To physically prevent the violent revolutions that destroyed the Sanmyo, they had to engineer a structural safeguard.
This is where we look at the systemic design known as Bansai Iki, the concept of an unbroken imperial line for 10,000 generations. Now, usually, we just hear this presented as a boast about bloodline purity.
That is how it is commonly understood, yes.
But you are saying Bansai Iki is actually a robust functional safety protocol. How does it stop a revolution?
Well, on the continent, the Sanmyo and Dongji were destroyed because the emperor logic inherently dictated that whoever possessed the strongest military force had the right to eliminate the current ruler and seize the throne.
Whoever has the biggest army wins.
Exactly. To guarantee this fatal systemic flaw was never replicated on the archipelago, the architects of the Japanese state engineered a total separation of powers. They completely separated sacred authority from practical administrative and military power.
So they put the sacred authority in an untouchable box.
Exactly. Sacred authority, the role of the supreme intermediary with cosmic providence, resided exclusively with the Tenno. Practical, day-to-day governance and military command were delegated to shoguns, regents, and eventually prime ministers. Because the seat of ultimate sacred authority is unconditionally monopolized by this single specific bloodline dating back to the mythic origins, usurpation becomes structurally impossible.
So even if a warlord amasses absolute military control and conquers every province in the country, they legally and structurally cannot become the Tenno.
They can wield all the terrifying practical power in the world, but they can never claim the sacred legitimacy of the throne. This brilliant, absolute structural separation effectively nullified the threat of violent dynastic revolution.
There was no point in killing the monarch because the warlord could never take the title anyway.
Exactly.
That secures the geopolitical borders and structurally prevents internal coups. But preserving this ancient paradigm required one final, deeply intimate step.
Yes, it did.
You have to ensure the actual biological lineage of the founders survives. You can't just pass down a title, you have to pass down the blood. This brings us to the indigenous people of the archipelago, the Jomon, and their absolute centrality to the survival of the Tenko legacy.
The biological integration between the continental exiles and the indigenous population is perhaps the most complex and awe-inspiring aspect of this entire historical framework.
It really is.
When Zhu Fu's fleet and the Tenzin tribe arrived on the archipelago, carrying the legacy of the three sovereigns, they did not land on an empty island. The land was populated by the Jomon people who had lived there for thousands of years.
And the Jomon possess a truly unique profile in the global genetic and archaeological record. Let's break down the genetics first.
Genetically, the Jomon people descended from the out-of-Africa D haplogroup, specifically the D1-2A lineage.
Okay, D1 and 2A.
Now, to understand why this matters, we have to look at how geneticists track human migration. The Y chromosome is passed almost identically from father to son.
Right, paternal line.
By tracking mutations in the Y chromosome, we can map direct paternal lineages back tens of thousands of years. The D1-2E haplogroup found in the Jomon represents one of the oldest, continuous, unbroken male lineages in the entire world.
Wow.
It is incredibly rare outside of isolated populations.
So they have an ancient, unbroken male bloodline. But what does the archaeology tell us about how they actually lived? Because if they were a violent society, this integration wouldn't work.
The archaeological evidence is striking. For over 10,000 years, the Jomon maintained a society that was fundamentally and systemically peaceful.
10,000 years of peace.
Yes. Across massive, extensive excavations of Jomon sites all over the archipelago, archaeologists find tools for hunting animals, like bows and spears.
Yeah.
But there is a glaring, staggering lack of evidence for weapons specifically designed for human-on-human conflict.
You don't find specialized swords or dedicated war axes. And you don't find mass graves of skeletons with defensive wounds, like parrying fractures on their arms, which are the hallmark of prehistoric warfare.
Precisely. There are no signs of systemic violence or mass warfare. Furthermore, the Jomon lack the concept of patrilineal surnames.
No surnames.
No. Surnames historically develop alongside hierarchical property-owning societies that use violence to protect or expand their territory. The Jomon had none of this.
Let me frame this with an analogy for the listener. You have a precious, incredibly fragile seed, the pure, peaceful paradigm of Tenko.
Yes.
It has barely survived a harrowing ocean crossing after being nearly crushed by the warlord-dominated emperor system of the continent. If that seed had landed in a territory that was already dominated by aggressive territorial warlords, it would have been immediately stamped out.
It absolutely would have.
Exiles would have been militarily slaughtered, or their culture would have been violently assimilated and erased.
The sovereign paradigm would have gone extinct the moment it hit the beach.
But instead, they land among the Jomon. The Jomon already possess an inherently peaceful, non-combative society. Because of that specific cultural and biological profile, were the Jomon quite literally the only population on Earth capable of safely receiving, integrating, and nurturing the Tenko paradigm.
That is the inescapable conclusion of this biological analysis. The Jomon society was uniquely, perfectly primed to serve as the sanctuary for this paradigm. But the mechanics of how they integrated the two populations is what ensured its survival. The systemic protocol to preserve the Tenko lineage did not occur through a violent male conquest of the indigenous people.
Okay, so how did it happen?
It occurred intricately via the maternal line.
Walk us through how that maternal integration actually functioned in practice.
So we have the world's oldest continuous male lineage, the Jomon D haplogroup. This lineage essentially acted as the biological host, the deeply rooted vessel.
Right.
The incoming Tenzin tribe, led by figures like Nigi Hayahi, carried the direct genetic and cultural legacy of the Dongyi and the three sovereigns. To permanently integrate these two groups without destroying either, a highly intentional, generations-long marital practice was established.
They merged the bloodlines deliberately.
Yes. The evolving imperial family, representing the indigenous Jomon male line, consistently and exclusively welcomed women who carried the blood of Nigi Hayahi's direct line to serve as their empresses and consorts.
Women from powerful clans like the Mononobe, who were the direct descendants of these continental exiles.
Exactly. This was far more profound than standard political alliance building. It was an ongoing biological ritual.
Oh, so?
Well, while the Y chromosome tracks the paternal line, mitochondrial DNA is passed strictly from a mother to her children.
Right.
Through these specific marital practices, the Jomon male host continuously absorbed the genetic and cultural legacy of the Tenko sovereign paradigm via the maternal mitochondrial DNA of the empresses.
Oh, I see. So by ensuring the mothers of the next generation of rulers were always of the Tenko lineage, they completely guaranteed the preservation of that legacy.
Yes, this biological protocol ensured the pure, unadulterated preservation of the Dongji and Tenko legacy, nesting it securely within a male line that was unbroken and famously surnameless.
That is a brilliant strategy.
It was an absolute synthesis. The world's oldest peaceful male lineage merged with the world's oldest peaceful civilizational paradigm, transmitted securely through the female line.
And we can see the ultimate manifestation of this synthesized system in the early rulers of Yamako, the priestess queens.
The ruling style of the early priestess queens, most famously Himiko, represents the purest expression of this synthesized sovereign system.
Because she didn't lead armies.
She did not govern by leading armies into battle or wielding a sword. She ruled entirely as a spiritual intermediary. She worshipped cosmic providence, maintained harmony, and deciphered the will of the heavens to ensure the agricultural prosperity of her people.
It was the exact ideological descendant of Tenko, observing the stars on the platform at Bashidana.
Exactly. The paradigm was perfectly preserved, functioning seamlessly within the biological vessel of the Jomon lineage, protected by the geographic isolation of the archipelago.
Let's pull back and look at the sheer scale of the journey we have taken today.
It is a massive scope.
We started in the Neolithic wetlands of Hunan province. We looked at the Pengtushan culture and the Bashidang site, establishing the physical archaeological reality of the land of Tenko. We saw the empirical proof of humanity's transition from raw meat to cooked food, the domestication of rice, and the birth of a peaceful sovereign paradigm guided by astronomical observation.
And then we tracked the catastrophic collision of that peaceful system with the violent, military-driven emperor paradigm emerging from the Central Plains.
Right, the Battle of Zulu.
We followed the displacement of the founders, the Donji, as they retreated south, transforming into the Sanmyo and fiercely defending their identity as the legitimate seedlings of the three sovereigns.
And when the continent was finally consumed by the horrific, annihilating unification wars of Qin Shi Huang, we followed the desperate maritime exodus of Shu Fu and the Tenzin tribe.
Yes, they packed their seeds, their advanced metallurgy, and their entire cosmology onto ships, executing a massive, calculated evacuation of civilization to the eastern seas.
Upon arriving on the Japanese archipelago, they encountered the indigenous Jomon. We analyzed the intricate biological synthesis that followed, where the unbroken Jomon male line absorbed the ancient Tenko lineage through maternal mitochondrial DNA.
This biological integration, combined with the structural genius of the Bansi-Ikkai separation of powers and the geopolitical adoption of the Tenno title, formed an impenetrable shield.
Ensuring the violent emperor logic could never destroy them again.
Exactly.
It is the ultimate story of a civilization choosing preservation over conquest. They utilized geographical isolation, brilliant structural governance, and highly specific biological integration to systematically preserve their society in isolation.
They survived the inevitable collapse of violent continental empires by completely removing themselves from the equation.
It forces a profound reevaluation of how human societies handle existential threats. It demonstrates that ultimate endurance isn't always won on a battlefield. Sometimes it is won through the meticulous, generations-long preservation of knowledge and lineage within a safe harbor.
That is a very poignant way to summarize it.
Which leaves us with a lingering, provocative thought for you to mull over. As we look at the architecture of our own modern world, facing an increasingly unstable global order, shifting climates, and the constant hum of conflict, what critical aspects of our own humanity are we actively failing to preserve?
That is the real question.
If the descendants of Tenko were willing to pack their entire civilization onto ships and sail into the unknown to find a sanctuary, where is our modern sanctuary? And more importantly, if we had to pack our own civilizational ship tomorrow, what exactly would we deem worthy of saving? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the physical reality of ancient myth. Until next time, keep exploring the hidden layers of history.